Should we just start now, or should we give it a couple more minutes? What do you think?
I've just pressed the record button, so
Okay.
Yeah, I'll introduce you now.
Great.
Okay, so welcome to the second and final session for today. We now have Joe Ryle, who's the campaigner for the 4-day week campaign. He's been an advisor to Chancellor John McDonnell, held other various roles. He's going to speak to us about the case for the 4-day week. Thank you very much to Joe for being here.
Great. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the introduction. I think I'll speak for at least 20 minutes anyway, and see what I've got left at the end. And yeah, looking forward to hearing lots of questions. Yeah, so I'm the campaign director now for the 4-day week campaign. Just a little bit about the campaign itself. It's a campaign that's existed for about 4 years now. And it's been a sort of very voluntary-led campaign up until about a year ago. So just literally an unincorporated campaign group. But had probably the biggest success of the campaign originally was getting the Labour Party to adopt a 4-day week in their manifesto at the 2019 general election. But actually, it's been since the COVID pandemic that we've really seen the 4-day working week rise in prominence and sort of gather some momentum. And yeah, that it was about July last year that I came in as the paid campaign officer role, which was the first time the campaign had some funding. So we're in that process now of kind of, we are the national campaign organisation for a 4-day week, but we're talking about incorporating and have been running things like an accreditation scheme for companies that have moved to a 4-day week. So it's really really what we've witnessed is a kind of real growth and interest in the idea since the pandemic, really. Not but I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. So normally when I talk about a 4-day week, I usually start by just answering the question of what is a 4-day week, because it can be misunderstood sometimes. And what we mean by a 4-day working week is a 4-day 32-hour working week with no reduction in pay. And the crucial part there is a reduction in hours. We think from a sort of mental health and well-being point of view, there needs to be a reduction in hours. Now, sometimes the 4-day week gets confused as a 4-day week, sort of a 5-day working week, but compressed into 4 days. So working the same amount of hours, on average 40 hours a week, in 4 days. And that's not, I want to be clear, that's not what we're campaigning for, not what we mean by a 4-day week. Yes, in some cases it may be better for some people to be working a 5 days amount of hours in 4 days, but that's still not solving the problem of overwork and burnout and stress and mental health issues, work-related mental health issues. The crucial thing is a reduction in hours. Working 4 very long days, say 10-hour days, 12-hour days, is not the answer. Okay, and then moving on to like a historical context for a 4-day working week. Why is now the time for a 4-day week? I think there's some crucial moments in history which are worth reflecting on. The main one being that it was about 100 years ago, almost exactly 100 years ago, that the kind of the 5-day working week and the weekend was one. And a large part of that was led by the trade union movement at the time. And by the end of the 1930s, most of the Western world anyway moved to a 5-day week, and we had the weekend. Before that, we used to work 6 days. And so it's interesting that, given we've had a whole century since then, and the world of work has completely transformed since then, that we're still working. The dominant model of work is still this 9 to 5 5-day working week for most people. And we would argue that it's just not fit for purpose anymore. What was a system of work that was designed for a kind of agricultural, economy, essentially, is not fit for purpose for 2021. Since the 1980s, so there was since the weekend was one, there was a kind of gradual reduction in hours in the UK anyway until about the 1980s. But since then, reduction in working hours have pretty much stalled completely. In the UK, we've not had any major reduction in hours since then. And that's worrying, given that part of the promise with automation and new technology was going to free us all up to have more free time, more leisure time, and that hasn't happened. And the situation now is particularly extreme in the UK, where we work some of the longest full-time hours in the world, longest full-time hours compared to any other country in the EU, apart from Greece. I know we're not in the EU anymore, but there's still a comparison to be made there, while having the least productive economy and the fewest number of bank holidays. So working this much, working the excessive hours that we do, this is full-time hours I'm talking about, is not resulting in a good outcome for both employers and employees. It's not making us very productive. Yeah, I think that's gives a bit of a historical context to the kind of the history of the fight for reducing hours for more leisure time and where we've got to today. And of course, all of this has come about as a bigger conversation as a result of the COVID pandemic. And we know from history that in times of crisis, that's often when the biggest changes happen. And we're hoping that we can take advantage of that and try and build a better world of work coming out of the pandemic. And we think the reason we say 4 days, 32 hours is we think about there's various different ways you can do it, and some companies go down to 28 hours, or some do the other way and go 35 hours. We think about 4 days, 32 hours is about the right work-life balance, and that's why we're quite clear on that one. Of course, the COVID pandemic has opened people's eyes to the fact that the world of work can change very quickly when we want it to. No one would have predicted that overnight, pretty much, that most workers in this country moved to working from home. No one would have predicted that before, and no one probably would have predicted the furlough scheme, which was a very generous scheme by a Conservative Chancellor, where at its high point, again, more than half the country were on furlough, were receiving their wages from the government. And so that has opened people's eyes to different changes at work, and I think has given people a bit of a thirst for changing. There's a big conversation now about flexible working and what that looks like. And while we'd love to see more flexibility built into world of work, and that can operate with a 4-day week, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has a Friday off of a 4-day week. Sometimes there's other companies that do it more flexibly, different. There'll be rotating days depending on how much of a customer-facing team people have. While a greater conversation about flexibility is good, we do think there needs to be a more concrete step to ensure that these changes to the workplace do actually benefit workers, and that's where the 4-day week is very clear. And we're looking at now bills tabled in the US and hopefully in the UK for a 32-hour working week, and you can see that's the way the conversation's headed. Yeah, and I think the other thing that COVID, the other reason that COVID highlights the need for a 4-day week is that it is a solution for reducing unemployment, because there's a strong argument that in times of economic recession and economic crisis, and this has again historically been the case, it's often a time where shorter working hours is used as a tool to share the existing work more equally across the economy. And now's a good time for that. And we even saw the Rishi Sunak introducing a shorter hours scheme as a response to the coronavirus pandemic, as one way of helping in these times. And that argument's not going to go away. If we think about new technology still to come, more automation, there's a very, very strong argument that the 4-day week is almost future-proofing the economy to ensure that actually this jobs disappearing and work disappearing doesn't necessarily have to be a thing that we're scared about. If we can share the work more equally across the economy and boost wages, then we don't need to be scared of automation. And I think that's where the 4-day week really comes into its own. Yeah, so hopefully that gives a bit of the kind of like historical context and the context we're in right now. And it's it's not just something that the UK is talking about by any means. We've seen the Japanese government encouraging companies to adopt 4-day weeks there, and Japan's famous for overworking. They have their own term for overworking. I think it's called karoshi. We've seen Spain now trialling a 4-day week. We've seen Scotland trialling a 4-day week. We've seen successful trials in Iceland, which actually led to permanent reduction in hours to about 35 hours a week for 86% of the country. It's a very significant change in working practices in Iceland, and in that Iceland trial, which was shown to be overwhelmingly successful, worker well-being went up, and it was still good for organisations too. Just coming on to some of the benefits, what are the kind of obvious benefits of a 4-day week? We tend to categorize the benefits of a 4-day week into 3 categories, and we say 4-day week would be good for the economy, good for workers, and good for the environment. Be good for the economy through greater productivity. 9 times out of 10, when a 4-day week is trialed or implemented, productivity either goes up or stays the same. So you're not actually getting less output from your workers on 4 days rather than 5, even if there's a kind of 20% reduction in hours, and that is proved, that is shown now through various different studies, and I think is more widely understood than it was at least a few years ago. Lower unemployment, again, I've already talked about that, but that's a really clear benefit. 4-day week can be used to reduce unemployment and create work for others, which also then has the potential to bring in greater tax receipts in the longer term, because if you've got more people employed, you've got more people paying tax. So there's different ways of costing a 4-day week, and that's one potential positive benefit there. There's also a boost that would come to local economies, because as we saw in the pandemic, when people had more free time on their hands, they tended to spend that free time or spend their money more in the local economy, and we saw local shops benefiting from that. And that would be the case for a 4-day week. Local economies would benefit, whether it's the local leisure centre or local services. That is a potential benefit. Also for the tourism sector as well, there's evidence to suggest that both local high streets but also the tourism sector would benefit from a 4-day week, because people will be going more short breaks around the UK. Although I would say on that, and maybe that's an interesting discussion point for later, that there's obviously a bit of a contradiction there, because potentially people going on more flights, for example, that's not going to be good for the environment. And that has been flagged to us before. There's some contradictions there which maybe need working out a bit more. The main benefit is it's good for workers. We knew before the pandemic that most workers were stressed, overworked, burnt out, had work-related mental health issues, and as with many things from the pandemic seems to have exacerbated any current trends that did exist before, and that's definitely the case with work. And on average, people are working up to 2 hours more than they were before the pandemic, and that's partly because there's not any checks and balances in place with people working from home, because there's no one telling you when to, there's no moment that you come into the office or that you necessarily leave the office in the day. It's much harder to end the day, and much easier to start the day, it tends to be. So people are doing sort of an hour extra at the beginning, an hour extra at the end. And that's a big problem, actually. Better mental health and well-being at work would be a big one. More time to live fulfilled lives. I think we shouldn't forget the obvious. Like, having more free time is a good thing, because it enables us to do whatever we want to do with that, whether it's spending more time with family, spending more time with friends, going on more trips, spending time doing hobbies, or volunteering in the local community. It would give people more time to build a stronger community life. And there's some interesting crossover there with something like David Cameron's Big Society, which was widely seen as a bit of a flop, but I think there were some ideas in there which do cross over, and some conservative values within that Big Society project, which do cross over the 4-day week and giving people more free time to volunteer and to participate in their local communities. And then lastly, good for the environment. And there was very little evidence on this a few years ago, but there's more and more coming out. But it does look like, on the whole, moving to something like a 4-day week, would significantly reduce emissions, because there'd be much less commuting happening, and significant energy savings too from offices being closed, etc. Obviously, it's not as clear cut. Not in every case will people be producing less emissions. There might, as I said, there may be some people that might go and fly to Barcelona every weekend, and that's not going to be good for the environment. But the evidence is that on the whole, it would reduce emissions. And just having more time to engage in sustainable behaviours would be one other impact. So whether it's not having to buy a ready meal because you didn't have time to make, use more fresh food or whatever it is. Or there's lots of examples of ways just having more time would enable us to think more seriously about climate change and to think more seriously about changing some of our more polluting behaviours. So there's tons and tons of benefits for a 4-day week. There's loads of others I haven't gone into in terms of the sort of gender impact as well, really positive impact on gender. But those are kind of three main ones that we try and condense them down to. And so it's quite a nice part of my job is that we sometimes struggle to just pick three key messages, three key positive benefits, because there is so many ways in which it would transform society. So coming on to some of the examples I already mentioned, there's kind of Japan, Spain, Scotland, Iceland. Actually, the Irish government too are running a pilot next year. So it really is it's an idea which is sort of growing in international prominence, and we've been partly at the heart of that, bringing this international coalition together, having regular meetings with the different campaign groups across the world. There was some other bigger, higher profile examples as well. Microsoft in Japan famously trialed it, I think in 2019, and actually the results of their, I think it was a 6-month or a year trial, I can't remember, but the results of their trial showed that productivity went up by 40%, which is huge. You expect 20%, which makes up for the loss in hours, but 40% is a really, really big gain. So it shows that it can be, when it's implemented properly and well, it really, really can boost productivity, which is obviously something a lot of businesses are concerned about. The global brand Unilever announced a year-long trial in their New Zealand office, which is happening at the moment, and they've said that if that's successful, they'll look to roll that out globally. So that's a big one to keep an eye on. And a bunch of other examples. The social media organization Buffer, you may have heard of from the US, which people use to kind of channel all of their social media channels in one place. They moved to a 4-day week during the pandemic and have now decided to stick with that. And it's about 90 staff across. It's an interesting one because it's 90 staff, but they will all work across the globe in lots of different countries. So it's been, I think, a bit of a kind of logistical challenge to implement, but they got there in the end. And for them, everyone has Friday off apart from their customer service team who rotate their days. So it does show that there can be flexibility built into a 4-day week, and often where it is less rigid and kind of good consultations gone on with workers beforehand to implement it in the best possible way. That's normally where it tends to work best. And we do often advise that just running with doing 6-month trials is a good way to go, because it means you can iron out any problems along the way. It is a big shift for an organization, especially in terms of the HR requirements and that sort of stuff. So that seems to work quite well. Just looking at my notes. And we launched in the UK. We launched a accreditation scheme modelled on the Living Wage Foundation's accreditation scheme, which interestingly they launched about 10 years ago, and they launched with 10 companies signed up, which is exactly what we were launched with. I think we had 12, but nearly 10. And the Living Wage Foundation now have 10,000 companies signed up. So it does show the kind of where you can get to, and that's kind of an inspiration we've taken with our model. We've now got about 32 signed up. So it's a very, very, very small number if you look at the overall picture of number of organisations in the UK. But there's a big range of them in there. So it's quite interesting to see that it's really not just white collar office based jobs at all. There's packaging companies and so I can't remember the other ones off the top of my head. But have a look if you get a chance to check it out. 4-day week accredited employer page. And it does seem to be the case that there are a number of small businesses just getting on with it and doing it themselves, which is encouraging, because we can't always expect companies to just implement it off their own backs, but it does seem to be happening to some extent. And just to give I guess the clearest, it can be quite hard in this job to know exactly how much impact you are having and how many companies are thinking about this. But there was a survey out. It's probably the best, clearest example, just to give a bit of an idea. There was a survey out by Be the Business, a business organisation, a couple of months ago, and that showed that 5% of companies in the UK already work a 4-day week, and that 20% are considering it after the pandemic, which is does equate to quite huge numbers. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's something like 3 million companies considering it. So it is, we are in this moment where potentially we are going to see a huge shift to the 4-day week, regardless of whatever the government does. Companies may just get on with it and do it themselves, the ones that can. So that's very exciting, and we do seem to get the feeling that the more companies do it, the more other people see it happening, and it kind of and see that it works, and that kind of eases any fears that kind of businesses have. So there does seem to be a bit of a domino effect going on. The more companies we can get to do it, the more others think about doing it, or kind of are encouraged to move beyond any hesitancy they had before. Yeah, and we're feeling quietly confident that there is a growing inevitability now about the need to move to shorter working hours. Particularly thinking about automation and new technology still to come. You can see now that, like, in 10 years' time or something, that it feels inevitable that we'll be moving. Essentially, we want to see the entire economy move to a 4-day week, and we accept that's not going to happen overnight. There's got to be a transition to get there, but we see absolutely no reason why you couldn't do something like that over, say, something like a parliament. And we have a number of pieces of research out at the moment to kind of iron out some of the gaps in the research. So we're looking at how you'd implement it, because the problem is that unless you have a government that's going to implement, say, a maximum 32-hour working week, and then the whole economy transitions to that, then you're doing it in a much more bitty sector by sector way, and it is just more difficult. So we have some studies out at the moment into feasibility study, how you'd implement it in schools, how you'd implement it in the NHS, particular challenges with the NHS, because there's huge job vacancies there at the moment, 100,000 job vacancies. But the evidence we've looked at so far seems to suggest that actually the 4-day week could be used as a way of retaining jobs in the NHS. Part of the reason there's so many job vacancies is that people are just, what is asked of them is just so ridiculous and not sustainable, that immense burnout from staff there. So we're looking at that. We have a study into how you'd implement the 4-day week in the construction sector, which is an interesting one. And the evidence is less clear around productivity gains there, but actually some of the stuff that's coming back from sort of directly from construction workers is that in the long term, because their bodies take such a battering in the construction sector, something like a 4-day week would be really beneficial in the long term, and would mean that construction workers wouldn't have to retire early, which is one of the sectors where, if not the sector where people retire early. It's just partly because it's just so exhausting and so damaging for their bodies working that hard 5 days a week. So there's lots of interesting stuff going on, and we've also got working with 3 public authorities, local councils in the UK, into a feasibility study about how you trial it in a local council setting, and hopefully off the back of that feasibility study we may see the first ever public sector trials in the UK. I'm feeling quietly hopeful, but there's a bit of a journey we need to take them on, and there's a lot of hesitancy. And it's interesting because actually the potential trials in a local authority setting basically ask the question of, can you implement it across society? Because there's so many services that local councils provide, whether it's from care sector to bin men to office-based jobs. It's the challenge. You're basically answering all the questions through a public authority. So that's quite interesting. I've got the last few things. I'm just going to plug in my laptop because it's just running out of battery. Just give me 2 seconds and I'll just do the last bit. 1 sec. There we go. So yeah, I guess just moving on to conclude, in terms of, I guess I just want to address how do we achieve a 4-day week, and our kind of strategy with the 4-day week campaign is both a bottom-up and a top-down strategy. So yes, we'd love to see the Conservative government ultimately implement a 32-hour maximum working week bill, and we're looking at getting that bill tabled anyway by a Labour MP in the next couple of weeks as a private member's bill. That would be the ideal. If you could ask me what one thing would you want to happen, it would be that. But the Conservative government, while relaxing their position on a 4-day week, they don't seem to come out and criticise it anymore. And we have had talks with Treasury ministers while they have relaxed their position, and they're kind of more open to it. They're not going to be implementing anything like that anytime soon. So therefore you have to look at a bottom-up approach too, and so that is partly happening by itself. There is companies and businesses there, but isn't enough of an appetite out there where a small but significant section of the business community and organizations are just implementing it and doing it, which is good. But history would tell us and would show us that we can't rely on bosses to implement it themselves, and there is going to have to be a bit of worker power, workers using what power they have, and that's where the trade unions come in. And we were really, really encouraged that on Tuesday, the Trade Union Congress passed the motion, which was unopposed, so backed by all the trade unions, to campaign for a 4-day week and a 3-day weekend. That was led by University College Union, but also backed by RMT and CW. So we see that as quite a significant victory, because we need trade unions, and we need people using their trade unions and using the collective bargaining processes that exist to demand a 4-day week from bosses, because we can't just rely on organizations just doing it, because history will tell us that's not going to happen. So it would be a significant boost to the campaign if the trade unions took this on board as their kind of priority going forward, and it makes sense to me as the one they should go for, because I think it would show people in the modern age what trade unions can do. I think people have forgotten that all of these workers' rights we have, which we take for granted now, whether it's sick leave, maternity pay, etc., is a result of trade unions winning those rights for us. And I think the 4-day week is a kind of logical next big thing for them to campaign on. So we're quietly confident we'll see more action from the trade unions on this. And constantly in discussion with the Scottish and Welsh governments at the moment to push them to do these trials. The Scottish trials should be there should be an announcement in the next couple of months. They're just working out it's a relatively small amount of money, but it's £10 million of funding, which they're not quite clear yet where that money is going to go, but it's to support companies in adopting this and trialing this. And looks like there's some start of some similar moves in Wales, so we'll see what happens there. I think that probably covers most of what I wanted to cover. I'm just having a look at my notes. I think that covers most, but there's probably some stuff I've forgotten that hopefully comes up through questions. I'd be really interested to hear what questions you have. But thanks for inviting me.
Great. Thanks very much, Joe. Lots to talk about there. So we'll take just a 5-minute break and come back at 5 past the hour. Think of things that you'd like to go over, philosophical points you'd like to interrogate. And I'll just turn my camera and mic off. You can leave and rejoin me.
I'll see you in 5 minutes.
Good. Okay, thanks a lot.
Hiya. How you doing?
Hi. Come back.
Thank you. Have we got everyone?
I will open up to questions, but I thought I might just ask one thing to kind of set the scene a bit. Thank you very much for that presentation. You make it sound so positive on just about all sides. I mean, it's good for employers, it's good for workers, it's good for the general public. Why, in your view, has this not happened already? What do you think the obstacles have been? Are they just habits that we've got into, or ways that we think about things we need to move away from, or?
I think that's a good. That's a very good question. I think there is a weird sort of nostalgia thing going on where we kind of like think that the 9 to 5 is a sort of British thing. It's sort of some sort of British tradition that we're proud of, or something like that. Even though no one's very happy with the amount they work. All the polls do suggest that people don't like working that much as they do. I think there is just a sort of scared, stuck in the past thing on this, where we just sort of scared of change, which is not fully explained. I mean, there's some evidence that does show there's a certain section of the population who wouldn't know what to do with the extra free time, which I do find quite sad. But it is a relatively small number, the polls suggest. But there is some section of the population who just can't imagine what they would do with that free time. And then I guess there is a specific thing of the Conservative government who have been in power for quite a long time in this country and have been who perhaps see it as a threat to more to capitalism or to kind of economy they want to operate. But I don't think it really needs to be that. It can be a win-win policy for both employers and employees, and that is shown to be the case in lots and lots and lots of examples, and we do make that argument very clearly. But I do think, there's some of that going on, and just kind of inertia about the past. But it's interesting, even just the fact that it's suddenly being talked about very quickly in lots of different countries across the world does show that you can quickly change that. And I think maybe we've learned that. People have learned that from the pandemic too. But yeah, there is some of that blockage going on, and there is also just the reality that, as I was saying earlier, unless you implement it kind of across the economy, so the government legislates for it across the economy, it does create problems. And there are just some companies who wouldn't be able to afford it under the current scenario. And say, for example, say you're a restaurant that needs to be open. Although interestingly, we are seeing more and more restaurants trialing a 4-day week. But say you're a restaurant that can only make profit by being open 6 or 7 days a week. It is just a lot more difficult to implement. And yes, you can be more strategic with shifting rota patterns to ensure that no staff are working more than 4 days. There are some cases where organisations would need to hire more people, and some of those just can't afford it, and so that does present a logistical challenge to overcome. The Kurzarbeit scheme in Germany is worth looking at, because that's operated since 2008 and basically subsidises workers having their 5th day off. It subsidises that, and they introduced that in response to the global recession in 2008. I've actually kept it in place since then, because that does reduce unemployment, and then the government in the long run does get money back in tax receipts by employing more people. So there are schemes like that which could operate to enable the transition to a 4-day week too, but they aren't in place at the moment. So for some organisations, they will just be like, I can't afford that right now. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I will open up in a second. In fact, you can start putting your hands up now as you think of things, but I'm just trying to sort of frame this to get into some of the issues about distributive justice, say. So it's an interesting case because it seems like other workers' movements. I'm getting a hiss. Can people mute their mics if they're not? I haven't already. Well, doesn't matter. yeah, with other workers' campaigns, there have been winners and losers. The sick pay and living wage, this does sort of eat into profit. So you can see why employers want to resist that if they have the political power to do so. Whereas this, at least the way you presented it, seems like there's just benefits on both sides. But if this is a solution to unemployment, among other things, then I guess what that must mean is that if you're hiring more workers and people's salaries aren't going down, then there is an added expense here. So is the idea that this is funded by a government initiative? And if so, is it financed by higher tax on certain groups, or is it kind of a wash in the way that a fiscal stimulus is, that the increased economic activity ends up paying for itself? What's the thought there in terms of who bears the immediate cost?
Well, there's two things. I mean, in the short term, we think that there should be something like, and the TUC are calling for this now, which is basically what they did introduce, the shorter, calling for the shorter hours scheme, which Rishi Sunak introduced, to be made permanent, because that would enable organisations that believe they can't afford to implement it to do it. So that's the sort of short term. We think that just is a logical thing to do now anyway. They could just do that straight away. But in the longer term, when the weekend was won, so when we moved from 6-day week to 5-day week, that came in with no loss of pay, and everyone could afford it in the end, and there just was a recalibration. And if we'd say, if you're going to do something like that, you give it 5 years of Parliament as a kind of transition period to get there. And in that process, that the economy would just change. Wages would go up in some places, down in some places. It would shift, and the government would be in charge of that process and would see how to make that work. But it's not, unless that happens. It's you're playing off sectors against each other, which is a little bit of what's happening at the moment. And we still want to make the case for it, want to see as many people doing it, because the more people do it, the more it will domino effect. But that's the kind of what we see as the priorities.
Okay, thanks. I have one more question about it, but I think I should allow some others to come in. So maybe Deanna first, and I'll put my hand up and get in the queue.
Thank you. Thank you for that presentation. It was really interesting. I have one question that's very, very much motivated by my own interest, which is, in these pilots, is there any intention to measure anything else besides increases in productivity for employers? So do they come together with maybe attempts to measure work-life balance or changes in quality of life for employees, or is it a single issue thing?
Most organisations that run trials and that do an analysis of it, it's both. So it's on the one side productivity, on the other side it's worker well-being, and so that's often measured by surveys of staff, and that's done either they'll be done before the implementation, 1 month in, 3 months in, 6 months in, and that really does show you until when all the evidence I've seen, worker well-being seems to go up, mental health issues go down, people are managing to manage better at home with family asked of them, that sort of thing. So that it tends to be the case that most companies want to measure both of those two sides of the story. Yeah.
Thanks. Otto. Oh, did you want to come back on that? Yeah.
No, sorry, I was trying to lower my hand.
Oh, Otto, please.
Okay. Great. I guess my question is, so I don't know if the details of current legislation in different countries in the UK and others regarding how the 5-day work week is embedded into the legal structure, and not merely as a sort of social norm that companies and workers sort of sort of it's an equilibrium that arises from people's expectations and so on, and how much of it is just directly legislated. So I guess my question is, do you have a very concrete sort of legislative set of proposals, like how you implement this in the different parts of the legal scheme? Are you just taking, for example, the existing legislation regarding the 5-day work week and simply sort of replacing that with a 4-day work week, or actually trying to implement it more strongly into the legal framework than currently the 5-day work week is?
Yes, I can only talk to you about the UK really. I mean, I could go into a bit of other places, but the UK is the one I know well, which is basically the time's perfectly for amending the legislation, because the maximum working time laws that we have here are inherited from the EU, which we've of course just left. So it's the Working Time Directive 1998, which tell us what the maximum working hours, which is currently 48 hours. So it's way over the average. You know, average hours in the UK, they were 40 before the pandemic. They're more like 42 full-time hours. So actually 48, it's kind of a bit of a redundant law really, because there's also lots of opt-outs to the 48 hours. So there are, for example, lorry drivers and that sort of thing, where people are working way beyond the 48 hours, which is very worrying. But that current law is almost redundant, because the average hours are way less than 48 hours anyway, and it's an EU law which we need to update. So the public bill that we've drafted, which we're hoping a Labour MP to the table in the next couple of weeks, is to amend that Working Time Directive 1998 to bring the 48-hour maximum level down to 32 hours. And what we've done on that, which is literally copycatting the bill that was tabled in the US Congress a couple of weeks ago, doing the same thing, 32-hour working week. But what they did was they've put including the legislation, a clause where for anyone working over 32 hours, the employer would be penalised. They'd have to pay more to ensure that to make it not worthwhile for them to do that. So it would that would really help with this kind of making sure that the implementation of a 4-day week, 32-hour working week is not reducing pay. So that's the situation here. I know in country, it's worth saying in countries like Germany, France, they already work less hours. So France implemented 35-hour working week in the early 2000s, I believe it was, and they're now talking about potentially taking that down to 32 hours. Again, there's various conversations around how successful that was, and there's been lots of opt-outs and lots of clauses for companies to get away from not complying with a 35-hour week. But that was implemented, and Germany and other countries also have, on average, significantly less average working hours compared to the UK. So it'd be slightly different in each country.
Ben.
Hi. I was wondering if you think it's problematic at all that a 4-day work week, at least initially wouldn't be for all workers. I mean, you talked about this a little bit already. Obviously, people who are self-employed. You have people who, like doctors, they're not going to walk away from a dying patient on the table, whatever. What do you think about the ethics of that? What do you think about the I guess an opponent might say, by putting in place a 4-day working week, we're sort of exacerbating an inequality, sort of an inequality of outcome, but also an inequality of opportunity. You can look at it either way. It's already the case that some people work a lot longer hours than others, and some people maybe do it because they don't have a choice, and some people see it as a great opportunity to get filthy rich. And they're self-employed, so they can do it. So there are all sorts of ways in which you might think a 4-day work week would sort of polarize the way people work in a way that we're not quite polarized yet, although already maybe a little bit. Do you think that's an ethical problem? Just any thoughts about that?
I think it's a really good question, and one we're very aware of, and one that it does, it does sit, as someone who sees myself as a kind of progressive and believes in social justice, it does, it's a question that sits a bit uncomfortably with me. But I think we've always been clear that the 4-day week isn't the solution to solving all the problems in the economy. The reason why 0-hour contract, casual workers can't move to a 4-day week is because they're on 0 hours contracts. And so on the one side, we need to see 0 hours contracts scrapped, but they also need to see the living wage go up. The reason that they couldn't do it is because they're on rubbish contracts and they're not paid enough. So, they're separate issues that need to be resolved anyway. But we have been quite clear that the 4-day work week is not going to solve all those problems on its own. It's not going to solve all those problems. But at the same time, looking through the accredited companies on our website at the moment, we have packaging supplier, biomedical firm, engineers, consultants, geologists. We've had restaurants moving to a 4-day week. It's not just a cosmetics company, board game company. It's not just marketing into a 3D metal molding company. It's not just tech companies and marketing companies that can do it. It can be implemented in other sectors. Yes, it might be more tricky for some of them, but it can be done. So it really is a policy that can be done across the economy. And yes, more thinking and more work needs to be done on how to make it more possible in those sectors. But we are doing that thinking. We have commissioned that research specifically because we are thinking about exactly that question you just asked, because it does it does sit slightly uncomfortably, and we do. For it to be a popular policy that's implemented across the board, it needs to be seen as something that is for everyone. And we're not quite there yet. It's still relatively early days in the kind of attention we've seen it having. So I think that's probably my answer to those questions. And I guess I would also say, I'm not, I'm still happy about the fact that, let's say, traditional white collar office, but let's say the really traditional one, like it seems to be marketing companies, there's been a lot of them. I'm still happy for those employees of that marketing company that they're having a much better work-life balance and are working 4 days rather than 5. I'm happy for them that they get to live that life and get to talk about the positives of that to other people. I wouldn't want to deny them of that potential improvement in their lives just because others haven't necessarily got it yet. But the strong intention is to make sure and for us to have more clarity on how this can be implemented for everyone.
Thanks very much.
I feel like that kind of gets back to the line I was trying to pursue earlier. I mean, if you describe it that way, it sounds like the upshot of this, at the fundamental level, is you think about workers as a class. They're getting a bigger share of output, right? Because if it's not only that working time is getting shorter, but more people are being paid living wages. Zero, exploitative contracts are being abolished. If it's a package involving all of that, then that, it seems, gives you the answer to the question I started off with, is why there would be opposition to this, right? Because then somebody has to, if workers are getting a bigger share of output, then somebody has to be getting a smaller share, unless you think that overall output is just going to increase so much. You'll unleash some sort of spare capacity in the economy, but I suppose that's the tricky thing to establish. So I guess my worry is just that I'm very much in favour, obviously, of workers getting a bigger share of output overall, but it's not exactly a win-win situation, right? It is shifting the balance of power from owners of capital to sellers of labour at a fundamental level. Is that wrong? Or?
I think where productivity levels are shown to maintain themselves, so which is 9 out of 10 cases that I've heard of, where companies and organizations are getting literally the same amount of output from their workers or more, just because being better rested, having more of a break does mean that you come into work more motivated and more, you feel good about yourself. If people feel good about themselves, they want to perform better, they want to do a better job. In those cases, I think it literally is a win-win situation for both, because let's say one example. It's good to give examples to bring it to life, but there's another accredited company is Target Publishing. So they're a magazine publisher, one of the biggest independent magazine publishers in the UK. They moved to a 4-day week during the COVID pandemic, and they reduced pay by 20%. To save a bit money. They looked at incoming shocks and were concerned about their finances, so they reduced pay, used it as a way of reducing pay. But what they found is that they were just making the exact, the productivity stayed the same or went up. They were getting the exact amount of, their business was still as profitable as it was before. They actually were getting more. I think they managed to take on more jobs and more work with other magazines. And so then they reversed the decision to reduce pay and took pay back to what it was before. And they've talked very positively about the impacts it's had on all the workers and the managers as well, all the workers and managers' well-being and mental health. And that does tend to be the case 9 times out of 10. That is the situation, and I don't see who loses. I don't see anyone that loses in that situation.
Right. Okay. Well, might come back to this if we have time, but Simeon, I think there's a point here.
Hiya. I have loads of questions, to be honest, but I'll sort of ask 2 if that's okay. So the first was picking up on something that Ben said. Now this plays out more in the US, I think, than I'm not sure about the UK, but I know that this is the case in the US. Because I was reading, for instance, Daniel Markovits, who's a philosopher, has got a book about this. And basically, whereas 50 or 80 years ago, the highest earners tended to work the least, nowadays the highest earners tend to work the most. It doesn't work out perfectly, but as a general rule, people who earn the most actually do the most hours. So I wonder whether there might be a risk there that if we kind of reduce the number of hours that people work on average, that kind of legitimizes wealth for the wealthiest people. It makes them feel like they're even more deserving of it because they work more hours. So there was sort of a little bit of a worry there. And then the other thing I thought is, is there a concern that if we reduce the number of hours that people work, then this legitimizes or kind of makes it okay, other bad work practices? So for instance, people that don't have particularly good jobs, or they're not particularly autonomous in their work, things like that. And we kind of think, well, in an ideal world, we would address that, but at least they're working less now. So it's sort of not as big a deal. And if there is that sort of trade-off, why should we necessarily prefer reducing people's work as opposed to actually just making their work a lot more tolerable?
I've not heard either of those arguments made around being involved in discussing the logistics of moving to a 4-day week with lots of different companies. Now I've not heard that come up before, particularly around the wealth issue. I've not seen that play out. It does tend to be the case that when companies move to a 4-day week, they're quite a good exercise in looking at inefficiencies within an organization anyway, and looking at where workload isn't shared particularly equally. So it's often just that it's often a very useful exercise. Organizations seem to find it's a very useful exercise for looking at why it wouldn't be possible to get those productivity gains, and that often comes down to who's doing too much work compared to the rest, and it can expose kind of inequality of workload in workplaces, and can often results in people reducing meetings, reducing things that they were doing too much of that wasn't very efficient. So I do think they can be have a more positive impact on an organisation more generally, because it can feel more fair, like people are working a fair amount of work. So I've not heard that come up. It's not something I'm concerned about at the moment. Obviously, the more and more, and interestingly, didn't come up in Iceland either. where it was trialled on a much bigger scale. But you know, these Scotland and hopefully Wales trials will be interesting to see if any of this stuff does come up, because that'll be, you know, there's some proper funding gone into them and they'll be very thorough. But I'm not concerned about those issues at the moment.
This is a minor point. You mentioned that with the 4-day work week, we could spread work around among more people, get more people employed, and one of the benefits of this was higher tax receipts, which could then be plowed into all sorts of useful things that the government does. This may be very naive. I'm not an economist, but I would have thought that given that the income tax is progressive, if you want to maximize tax receipts, the best thing to do is to concentrate income in as few people as possible. Am I missing something?
I'm not saying that that implementing a 4-day week will necessarily be cost neutral, but there's actually a study out that I'm trying to get in the media at the moment in Germany, which looked at the cost of implementing it in the public sector, which involved having money for hiring more workers where that was needed, particularly in NHS. And that did very clearly show that in one scenario, through reducing unemployment, obviously there's an extra day's work that needs to be covered in some places, that it would cause social security payments to fall as well, and would bring in taxes from extra tax on people that weren't paying that before. So it could be a net positive economically, but we don't know that yet. I'm going to be honest about that. We don't know that yet. It's not been implemented at that scale yet to know that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, once you bring in the social security side of the equation, then it becomes a lot more plausible that that you can do this sort of cost-free. So yeah, that helps. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, I also have a sort of clarifying question, I think. So the situation you described, where it just really seems like a win-win in every way, where basically I do the same amount of work in 32 hours as I was doing in 40. So I'm happier because I get these extra 8 hours. The employer's happy because they get, or maybe I'd even do more. Then I don't see the macro benefits like reducing unemployment, because presumably there's no incentive for my employer to hire a new worker if they're getting the same amount of work as they were anyway for the same amount of money. So that was one thought. And the other thought, which came up when Deanna was presenting on the 4-day week, these very positive-looking situations with individual companies, it might be because they're doing this alone, or they're one of few companies who are trialing this, and so you might see the effect of, well, you attract all the workers who want to come and work for a company that gives them a 4-day week. So initially you get the best, the most talented, the highly motivated workers. But maybe when the whole economy does that, it could look different. So I guess, I don't know, those are related questions, because I suppose they're both about what you can learn about trying this on a macro scale from looking at it on a micro scale.
I guess I'd just point you towards it was the Autonomy, the think tank that do lead on shorter working week stuff, and their proposal was looking at in the public sector. So it costed implementing it now in the public sector. I can't remember what the total amount was. I haven't got it in front of me, but that showed that it could create up to 1 million jobs in the UK. So I think you're right. There's an important point actually. There are certain workplaces where it wouldn't create extra work, but it's across the board. There are places where it really would create extra work. So, for example, in schools, NHS, care sector, a number of others that I haven't got off the top of my head, but that, yeah, across the board, it would create extra employment opportunities. But you're right that in that specific case where, let's say, that magazine publisher, where the productivity stayed the same, workers are much happier, that's not creating extra work. So I think, yeah, I hadn't actually thought about that so clearly before, so I think that was useful. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, that's good. I will look up that autonomy.
I'll try and find it and post it in the chat if I can find it.
Yeah, cheers. And Simeon has a question while you're looking.
Yeah, can I just invite you to say a little bit more about how this would affect like the gig economy? Because I think, I mean, yeah, obviously I think you kind of touched on self-employed people, just because that seems like a particularly difficult kind of industry where you might be able to roll something like this out, where obviously I know like now Uber is unionized by GMB, I think, but it's generally like not very unionized. People's like incomes are highly contingent upon like how much they work and stuff. And obviously the gig economy is growing a lot as well. So could you just sort of say a little bit more about kind of how you see the 4-day week playing out there?
Yeah. To be completely honest and on you on that one, that is one area where it's not fully worked out. And we have a study, James Meadway, who's an economist, he's said it should have been in my inbox today, that he should have sent me the first draft to how you'd implement a 4-day week for self-employed and casual workers. And some of the, just to give you a bit of a feeling for some of the things he's looking at, that's looking at the kind of self-employed scheme that we saw during the pandemic, and looking at best practices around supporting the self-employed during the pandemic, and how you'd apply that to a more permanent thing to enable those sets of workers to move to a 4-day week. So we don't fully have the answer on that. It doesn't exist now, as far as I'm aware. I haven't seen anyone else that does. But yeah, that was something that we identified that was a big sort of major gap in the research. But I do think, again, going back to it, the answer there is banning 0 hours. Like, you have to give those workers proper contracts that can be protected before they can have a 4-day week. And yes, the self-employed and casual workers that are making enough money, that are maybe on higher incomes, there's nothing stopping them from taking the decision themselves to move to a 4-day week. But obviously, those on low incomes aren't going to be able to afford that, and that has to be the priority, really. But we are really trying to think about how you prioritize those people on lower incomes. How is a 4-day week possible for those workers? And it's partly just really, really, really difficult while they have no workers' rights and while they're on 0 hours contracts. But there may be something like the kind of self-employed scheme we saw during the pandemic that could be implemented more permanently to enable those workers to move to a 4-day week. So yeah, don't fully have the answers on that one yet, but very happy to share that report with you when it comes out. It should be in the next couple of weeks.
Thanks. Ben.
This question is, it's very speculative, very, very out of nowhere, but I'll ask it anyway. So I think one thing that we're sort of increasingly learning about human nature is that people learn to sort of adjust their desires to what they think is possible or likely, and also that people's feelings of well-being, to a much greater extent than we ever thought, are determined by comparing themselves with those around them. So taking those two thoughts forward, should we be worried that this apparent miracle where you move from a 5-day week to a 4-day week and just as much work gets done, that this is sort of a result of a glow, sort of a glow from suddenly having something that exceeded your expectations, and furthermore having something that other people don't have? And that if we let this play itself out over a long stretch of time, people's expectations, their perceptions of what's normal will adjust. Just like we now think a 5-day working week is normal, and nobody suggests that we're all experiencing some. Well, maybe people do suggest that we're experiencing some monumental benefits from no longer having a 6-day working week. I don't know. I've never heard that, but just after a while, things will sort of settle. Things will sort of bed in. The increased productivity will go away. 4-day working week will just be what everybody has. It's what everybody expects. It'll feel like just the slog a 5-day week used to feel like, and productivity will go back to where it was. And is that at all a reasonable worry?
I mean, I don't think that's an unfair assessment, but I don't see it as a miracle. I mean, it's like countries around Europe that already work less hours on average are more productive. You know, that is just a fact. And
I didn't mean to say it's not happening. I meant to say that it seems like a miracle that it is happening. You know.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think what you said there was unfair. For me, it's kind of, we've talked about a productivity crisis and productivity puzzle in this country. If it's a big sort of puzzle, and they've tried so many things, what they haven't tried yet is just working less. When you look at all of the stats of how many, it's quite stark to put them next to each other. Then you put the total full-time working hours across Europe compared to productivity, and there's no correlation between working more and that producing. Once you get to about like 32, 35, there's no working more hours doesn't produce more productivity, and that seems really obvious looking at that data. And I do think the Iceland, I would recommend reading that report that came out about the Iceland, the pilots in Iceland, because that was as clear as ever, that it can be done. It doesn't need to be that difficult, and does produce. It does literally produce, the story that you just told there. Well-being goes up, productivity goes up. It is a winner, and it costs very little in Iceland to do that in the public sector. There's going to be some additional costs which we do need to work out, which aren't completely clear yet, and that depends on the way that you implement it. But I do really think in 10, 15 years time, we will be looking back and saying, why on earth did we work 5 days a week for such a long time? I do think that is going to happen.
Thanks much.
Thank you. Ben Mullins.
Yeah, sure. So are you campaigning for a 4-day week because you think it's kind of like the best solution, all things considered, or are you campaigning for a 4-day week because you think it's a good solution from where we are? So, for example, why are you not campaigning for a universal basic income or another kind of solution?
I think it's about, for me, it's like, I guess it's a more personal question. On a personal level, as someone who worked in a full-time job for 6-7 years, and a really extremely demanding job, at the top of the Labour Party, like, yes, I loved my job, but it was too much. It wasn't sustainable. It wasn't something that made me happy. It didn't give me enough time to explore anything else in my life, and made me stressed and burnt out. And that was a job that I was lucky enough to enjoy. And for a lot of people, there's of course the kind of David Graeber argument, the bullshit jobs analysis. For a lot of people, they don't enjoy their job, and yet they're still working the same amount. And it just struck me as a puzzling thing. Why do we do something every day, 5 days a week, that makes us unhappy for a lot of people? And you just look, you look across your week, 5 days of 7 is basically decided for you because you're working for, working for a boss. It doesn't strike me as the right way to live. I'd love to see a universal basic income, and there is a strong argument that implementing a 4-day week alongside it. I haven't actually used that as a example today, but there is a strong argument for implementing the two together. We tend to avoid that because we think that calling for one radical policy is hard enough. Calling for two at the same time is probably not good strategy, even though we would support. I personally love a universal basic income, but I do think there's a big thing about time here and the time we have in our lives, and I think we've lost sight of what might be possible if we had a bit more free time, and lost sight of other interests that we maybe have not seen along the way in our lives. So, just having more free time, also taking part in local, democracy. I think it would be 4-day week would be a good policy for democracy, because people could take part in local politics. They could maybe stand to be a councillor. They could have a bit more time to think about who's running in the elections and take part in that. there's so much, there's so much that we give in terms of taking back control of our lives and having more time, and I don't have all the answers for that because it'll be different for every person, but yeah, it does seem like a clear policy that would transform. For me, it would be very transformative.
Great, yeah. If you drive up from England to Scotland on the M6, you'll pass New Lanark, which is the mill that Robert Owen owned at one point, where he conducted the social experiment of having his child workers work a maximum of 12-hour days. Economist John Kenneth Galbraith, writing about this, said it tells you something about the time that this was considered lenient. His fellow capitalists would have wanted him to get an honest day's work out of these kids. So never underestimate how far off our assessments of what's possible might be, I guess, is a lesson. But unless anybody else has things they want to ask, I will just say it's always a really nice opportunity for us academics to talk to people who are on the policy-facing side of things. So I'm really grateful to you for coming and participating in this. And,
yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and good luck.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been really useful to be asked some of those questions as well that I hadn't, just shown me new ways of thinking about things and a couple of things I hadn't fully considered as well. So that's been really helpful because that will help with, as we develop our messaging and communication strategy over the next couple of years. That's been really good. Thank you.
Great. All right. Well, I'll see the rest of you later, and we will start tomorrow. As per the schedule, we have 3 talks tomorrow rather than 2. It's the big day. But thank you all for your questions and participation so far.
Take care. Good luck. See you later. Bye.